Economics and timber supply are the most often quoted issues. Opponents cry that there is an inadequate timber supply to meet current mill capacity and that we'll lose value-added benefits to the economy. Thousands of mill worker jobs will be lost. Proponents claim that a large reduction of export-related jobs and reduced revenues for Oregon trust counties will occur. Behind these issues, one wonders if lurking in the shadows are the issues of the spotted owl, old growth, and balance of trade deficit. Obviously, some jobs are going to be lost. We have to look for a solution in sound public policy. What should it be, and how do we get there? Besides our ballot measure, federal legislation has been introduced with broad-based support from Oregon banks, utilities, timber companies, unions, and environmental groups. To shed some light on the issues, we have in opposition State Senator Joan Dukes from Clatsop County, a trust in Port County. Senator Dukes holds a BA in political science from Evergreen State College and is a former Clatsop County commissioner. In support is State Senator John Kitzhaber, Senate President from Douglas County and co-sponsor of the legislation. Senator Kitzhaber is employed as an emergency physician at Douglas Community Hospital and is an associate professor at Oregon Health Sciences University. He graduated from Dartmouth and the University of Oregon Medical School. The format today is in part a traditional debate format. Each will have 5 minutes to open, 2 minutes for rebuttal, 3 questions to ask of each other, and then we'll answer questions from the audience. They will both close for 2 minutes at the end of the meeting. Senator Kitzhaber, as the proponent of the measure, will start. Senator Kitzhaber.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to debate the proposed log export ban here, and I'd like to thank the City Club for sponsoring this important forum. Let me begin by framing this debate and trying to put the issues in perspective. In 1968, the federal government banned the exports of raw logs from federally owned land, which is Forest Service and BLM land. And that was a very significant policy because 58% of the forested land in this state is federal land and is subject to the ban. Nonetheless, there has been a dramatic increase in log exports since the 1974 ban, primarily from state lands and from private lands. There's been an 85% increase in log exports between 1974 and 1988, and almost an 18% increase between 1987 and 1988. This export is coming from private lands, which constitute about 36% of forest lands, and from state lands, which constitute about 6%. This measure before us, ballot measure 2, speaks only to the ban on state lands. So we're talking about stopping the export of around 220 million board feet out of a total annual cut of about 8 billion board feet. So the issue here is not the volume of logs being banned to export, but the impact of this decision on the viability of rural timber-dependent communities in Oregon, and the impact of this decision on the proposal by the Bush administration to lift the ban on export of logs from federal forest land, which accounts for the majority of that 8 billion board foot cut. So why should we stop log exports? Let's start by looking briefly at some demographics. Oregon has the highest percentage of children under 14 in the nation, but also has the fastest growth of people over the age of 65 in the western region. The implications of this are significant. First, we have a shrinking workforce relative to a growing retired population. Since retirees pay no sales tax in this state and very little income tax, the workforce is supporting most of the needs not only of the retired population, but of Oregon society as well: schools, human resource programs, corrections, law enforcement, higher ed, etc. And although we have a very large group of people under the age of 14, which means we have the potential for a very good workforce, Oregon is shifting from a manufacturing-based economy to a service and retail-based economy with a heavy emphasis on tourism. This means that a loss of primary manufacturing jobs, family wage jobs, is occurring with a growth of lower-paying jobs. This trend over time will erode our revenue base and make it increasingly difficult to support our schools and the infrastructure needed to support a growing retired population. Log exports directly reduce manufacturing jobs. 1 million board feet of raw logs can support 4 sawmill jobs or 7 plywood jobs. In 1987, exports from state-owned forest land caused a potential loss of 400 to 500 jobs in the state of Oregon. Between 1987 and 1988, 45 plywood and sawmills in Oregon and Washington closed their doors, idling 3,268 workers, and the primary reason for closure was due to log shortages. When the Tillamook Forest comes online for harvest, and if there is a ban in place, there will be a tremendous surplus of logs in the Northwest region, which will result in mill expansion and increased employment. Domestic processing and value-added processing will significantly increase family wage jobs in Oregon and contribute significantly to the stability of local communities and to the state as a whole. So the first reason to ban log exports is to preserve and expand manufacturing jobs in the state of Oregon. The second reason is much broader and perhaps more significant. If the federal government lifts the ban on exports from federal forest lands, which account for 58% of forested lands in Oregon, the impact on the state economy would in fact be devastating. And for our congressional delegation to argue forcefully to retain the ban on federal forest lands in Oregon, while at the same time the state continues to allow the export of logs from forest lands owned by the state, will erode the credibility and the effectiveness of our position in Congress. The argument that the Oregon log export ban would force Japan and other countries to buy them elsewhere doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Only Canada can produce the quality of structural timber found in Oregon, and Canada already has a virtual ban on log exports with a 100% export tax. Oregon is not a rich state, but it is rich in people, and it is rich in raw materials, particularly in raw lumber, raw logs. We should use that raw material for manufacturing and secondary processing at home to keep Oregonians at work and to keep the Oregon economy healthy. Thank you.
Senator Dukes, your opening.
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for allowing us to have this discussion on what was one of the most emotional issues ever to go through the Oregon State Legislature. Even field burning received more accurate information in its discussion than did SJR 8, which has become ballot measure 2. There are a number of issues involved in this ballot measure, and I'm going to focus on two of them. The first is the trust agreements for the county forest trust land, and the second is the revenue impact involved in ballot measure 2. County forest trust lands is a term applied to those state forest lands that are not under the direction of the State Land Board. They came to the state beginning in the 1930s as cutover lands from counties through tax foreclosure. The state actively bargained with counties to acquire those lands on the promise that they would be used to produce revenues for the counties. To quote then Governor Charles Sprague in January of 1940, "The law directs the Board of Forestry to manage these forest lands in perpetuity, in trust for the counties and the taxing districts therein." A very specific formula for distribution was put into statute, and with very few changes remains intact today, and those changes were agreed upon by both the state and the counties prior to their enactment. In 1985, the state of Oregon attempted to trade a parcel of county forest trust land for non-productive timberland in Lynn County. 12 trust land counties took the state to court and won a judgment that reversed that land exchange. The trial court held that a contractual relationship existed between the state and the counties, and it was on that basis that they reversed a decision that would have reduced the income to those counties. It was because of the trust agreements that Section 7, subsection 2, was put into ballot measure 2. It begins, "notwithstanding any prior agreements or other provisions of law," thereby unilaterally violating those trust agreements and clearly saying on the part of the state of Oregon, we took your lands, we're going to keep them, and we're going to change the rules. It's kind of like the little kid who says, it's my ball and I'm not going to play. Only what they forgot was, it's not just their ball. Remember that these were tax foreclosed lands that would likely have ended up in private ownership, enlarging the taxable land base and reducing the tax rates to those districts. My local state forester estimates a 25% reduction in local revenues from a fully implemented ban. In the recently passed 89-91 budget for state forestry, that would mean a reduction of slightly over $7 million. This for a state agency that in the last biennium requested and received lottery dollars for management of those forest lands, things like pre-commercial thinning that they couldn't afford to do because they didn't have sufficient revenues. Cuts of this magnitude will have drastic results in forest management for the state of Oregon and far-reaching impacts on future timber supply. A ban on log exports would reduce the number of bidders permitted to bid on logs, thereby reducing the competition and lowering contract prices. A small handful of mill owners will immediately benefit by this lockout of full competition. And they receive this without ever having to give any assurances of full employment or even that they will not reduce employment, much less increase it. Who pays for the subsidy? Local taxing districts. Principally, they're school districts, and in the case of the Common School Fund land, they are entirely school districts of the state of Oregon. And it's certainly with the trust fund lands, they are more school districts. It's significant enough that they will likely have to go out for levies and tax bases. As to the emotional charges that exports from state lands close mills and put people out of work, let's remember that logs exported from trust lands comprise 0.2% of the total volume of timber harvested in Oregon. And in 1988, the export of trust land timber represented 2% of the total volume of logs exported from the state. Those were derived from the sales figures themselves. After all this, will the mills get the logs? Very possibly not. Ballot Measure 2 requires that timber be processed in Oregon, but does not define processed. A memo from the state forestry notes some enterprising soul will find a way to do minimum processing and export anyway. So let's put the emotionalism and political rhetoric aside and recognize that Ballot Measure 2 is really a mill subsidy paid for by taxpayers in local districts.
Senator Dukes, your rebuttal.
It's helpful in keeping all of this in perspective to stick with the issue. You can't compare all of the exports of logs from the state of Oregon when we're talking about Ballot Measure 2, because what we're talking about is exports from state timberland. You can't talk about what goes on in private timberland. You can't talk about what goes on in federal timberland except for that provision of Ballot Measure 2 that requests that we continue the ban on the export. But the state of Oregon cannot enact that. So while you may hear all kinds of interesting statistics, please bear in mind that the ones that you have to focus on, the ones that truly relate to Ballot Measure 2, are not 220 million board feet, but rather the 50 million board feet that truly come from state timberland. 19 million, in my case, from county forest trust lands exported will not keep even one mill going for 1 year. We're talking about an extremely small percentage, something that will not provide the jobs that you will hear. You'll hear the emotional rhetoric and you'll hear the sympathy pleas. Please remember that we're talking about state forest lands, the smallest amount of forest land in the state of Oregon. We have no control over what the private timber companies do, and we have no control over what the federal government do, and Ballot Measure 2 will not affect either of those.
Senator Kitzhaber, your rebuttal.
Let me speak briefly to the trust agreement and then the potential loss of revenue. This is a change in our Constitution which clearly is within the purview of the state to consider. This is a change in state policy because I think the issue here is one of statewide significance. The state does have a stake in the management of these forest lands because general fund dollars provided $14.9 million to reforest the Tillamook and other state trust lands. To date, $211,000 of that $14 million has been repaid by the counties. The state objectives in managing those lands include providing employment, encouraging full economic utilization of the forest resource, and providing for community stability. The ban on log exports with the increase of local processing of these logs is consistent with those management objectives. Concerning the fear over loss of revenue, this assumes that there is going to be a significant export premium which is rapidly disappearing. There are 4 sales that I know of in the last year that exceeded $400 per thousand, sales for domestic use, and one that exceeded $500 per thousand. So that export premium is rapidly disappearing. This argument also assumes that the logs won't be harvested and processed locally, and I think there's no evidence to support that. The surplus of logs that will be available when the Tillamook Forest comes online will provide mill expansion and a tremendous economic opportunity. There may be a slight reduction in revenue in the short run, but a significant increase in revenue in the long run from increasing employment at family wage jobs and increasing exports of finished products out of the Port of Astoria. Finally, I think we have to remember the other element of this debate, which is essentially to provide us additional leverage in Congress to prevent the current administration from lifting the ban on federal forest lands, which could have a very dramatic effect on revenues to the state of Oregon.
Senator Dukes, your first question of Senator Kitzhaber.
There are mills along the Oregon-Washington border that buy state logs from the other state and bring them back to their mills for processing. This ballot measure would prohibit a Washington mill from doing that. The measure disrupts a common practice productive to both states and asks for retaliation from Washington state. Was this even considered by proponents of this measure? And if not, why not?
Yes, I think it was considered by proponents of the measure, but I think we were convinced of the larger issue involved, and that is one of trying to find a way to support the long-term economic viability of timber-dependent communities in Oregon. There are communities in northwestern Oregon that will clearly die if their primary manufacturing industries are sent under due to a lack of available logs. We think it's very, very important for those communities to have access to raw logs to manufacture locally, and the log export ban will increase the availability of those logs. And I'd like to reiterate again that although we did consider the issue that Senator Dukes raised, the larger question, the really entry-level global question is, can we prevent the federal government from lifting that ban on federally owned forest lands in the state of Oregon? 38% of our base. And if we can't do that, I think we're in very, very serious trouble. This ballot measure increases our leverage in Congress to prevent the lifting of that ban.
Senator Kitzhaber, your first question of Senator Dukes.
Since 1 million board feet of raw logs could support 4 sawmill jobs or 7 plywood jobs, and since the Tillamook forest will provide significant raw material, why does it make sense as a matter of public policy to export those logs with a much less significant employment opportunity than to increase domestic manufacturing and employment?
Again, we have to look at the statistics being used. There is not 1 billion board foot of state forest land being exported from this state, nor is there likely to be any time in the near future. There is approximately 50 million board feet of state timberland going out in export. There is 1 billion board foot going out statewide. Again, we need to look at and remember that we cannot control the export of logs from federal or private timberland, and certainly the 50 million board feet that is going out will not substantially change the outlook of any mill in this state.
Senator Dukes, your next question of Senator Kitzhaber.
Restricting the export of timber forces people to choose between school districts and mills. It pits longshore and teaching jobs against jobs on the green chain. Why wasn't there an effort to formulate a positive method to help the forest industry instead of negatively forcing voters to choose between productive segments of Oregon's economy?
Well, I guess I would disagree with your initial premise. I don't think this pits longshoremen against people on the green chain. The question is, what are the longshoremen going to load on the ships, raw logs or finished products? I think that it doesn't pit school districts against mills. Clearly, the school tax rates in most of the districts that have Tillamook timber in them are extremely low, well below the state average. Even if they went up a bit, they would still be below the state average. But I would submit to you that you can maintain a school district more readily by increasing employment in the district, bringing more family wage jobs into the district, and increasing the value of the district through assessments on industrial property that would result from expansion of domestic processing.
Senator Kitzhaber, your next question of Senator Dukes.
There's a concern over the loss of longshoremen's jobs and the impact on the port of Astoria if we were to ban log exports, but the experience with other countries that have banned log exports has been an increase in the export of finished lumber. Indonesia used to provide less than 2% of Japan's finished lumber production. When they banned log exports in 1980, that increased to over 18%. I wondered why the same reality wouldn't apply to Oregon.
The main reason it doesn't apply is the Port of Tacoma. The Port of Tacoma presently pays or offers to pay for transportation costs in order to entice Oregon mills to ship up to the state of Washington and out of the Port of Tacoma. We have a mill in Warrenton that produces metric finished lumber, does not ship out of the Port of Astoria, ships out of the Port of Tacoma. The Port of Portland faces the same kind of difficulties in trying to entice Oregon finished products through their port. There is no reason to believe that this can happen. Certainly it is not economically feasible for the Port of Astoria, which barely survives from year to year, to be able to give those same kinds of incentives. The other piece of it is that the Port of Longview exports far, far more logs every year than we even dream of in any other part of this state, and that will continue. It's about 10 minutes up the river from the Port of Astoria. Port of Astoria is the nearest deep water port to the Pacific Rim, and we do run a serious risk of losing that nearest deep water port with a ban on the export of logs, because the export of logs is the principal occupation of the Port of Astoria.
Senator Dukes, your last question of Senator Kitzhaber.
The clear immediate beneficiaries of ballot measure 2 will be a small group of mill owners who, at least regarding Forest Trust lands timber, have been bidding successfully in spite of open competition. I have heard no assurance from mill owners that employment levels in their mills will be increased or even maintained if open competition is prohibited. Did proponents at least seek assurances of employment levels from mill owners in exchange? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't think in the legislative process you can seek that kind of assurance. I think the economic factors are fairly clear. If you have an opportunity to expand your mill and have a market that's going to receive those finished products, I think the economics will drive the expansion of those mills and increase employment. And I think this provides us with a tremendous opportunity to increase employment in certain parts of the state that will have a ripple effect not only in those communities but statewide. And again, I would like to hammer home the point that the larger question here involves our ability to make a cogent case before Congress that we should not, in fact, lift the ban on federal forest lands. And I find that it would be difficult to make that argument and somewhat hypocritical if we said you should keep the ban on federal forest lands, but we're going to allow the export of logs off of state lands. That erodes our intellectual position, and I think we need to be consistent and have the best opportunity we can to achieve that end.
Senator Kitzhaber, your last question of Senator Dukes.
Well, actually, since I think the audience is primed and ready, I'll defer my question and just ask her if she enjoyed the lunch.
Oh, we did. I did.
It's now time for questions from the audience. Please limit your questions to no more than 30 seconds. Each will have an opportunity to respond no more than 1 minute. I will alternate questions between the two, starting with Senator Kitzhaber. If you have a question directed to him, please go to the microphone on my left. If your question is directed to Senator Dukes, please go to the microphone on my right.
I hope this is the one for Senator Duke.
Yes.
It was my left. My name is Ralph Saperstein, and I'm a City Club member, and I apologize if this seems like a speech, but I learned from Dan Goldie. This ballot measure is really a tale of two different types of timber industries, and your city of Astoria is a perfect example of the dilemma we're facing. Supporting log exports encouraged a large multinational corporation, ITT Rainier, to move into Astoria.
Your time is up. Can you summarize?
With a log export facility. Meanwhile, Astoria Plywood, a worker-owned co-op with 350 employees, is struggling for log supply in Astoria. How can you support those two different companies?
The interesting statistic that doesn't seem to be widely realized is that the Astoria Plywood Mill has not even bid on a state timber sale in 19 years. Much less purchased one. And so the idea that now banning the export of logs, or not banning the export of logs from state timberland, will close that mill, and believe me, I have heard that at home repeatedly, doesn't hold water. What you're going to see is such a small amount of logs, of timber in relationship to the entire timber harvested in the state of Oregon, that it's not going to make a significant difference to any except those right around the area. When this bill was in the Senate, the first hearing, a lot of mill owners came, and a couple of them came to see me. One of them to explain that he had a mill outside of the area around the Tillamook burn, and 2 years ago they bought one within the burn area or nearby. They bought it for the exclusive purpose of milling Tillamook burn timber, which they hope to receive at a lower price once we ban the export of logs. That's what this debate is over. It's over the Tillamook burn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. I'm addressing the question to Senator Dukes, but it could just as well be addressed to Senator Kitzhaber or both.
He can jump in whenever he feels like it.
It seems to me that the real issue is sustainable development. The passing or the non-passing of this measure, will it foster sustainable development? And by that I mean a development that takes care of the present without preempting resources for the future.
No, I don't think there's any way it can do that. What it will do is buy a few more logs for a few more mills. But as far as sustained timber for the future, trees are a renewable resource. The management activity is going on. As I said in my opening speech, I have some concerns about the reduction in management with a severe reduction in money to do that, because the State Forestry Department gets approximately the first third off the sales of forest land, and they use that for management. So that could affect the quality of trees and the number of trees that we're able to produce on state timberland. But in terms of sustaining it for the future, I don't think this ballot measure will do a thing.
Thank you.
I would agree to the extent that the ballot measure alone will not provide the kind of stable position for our state to move into the 21st century, but it is an important step. It does provide the opportunity to provide some stability to some timber-dependent communities. I think if you compare what's going on in my community, which is dependent on a sawmill economy, and a community such as Senator Dukes that is dependent upon the export economy, there are some significant differences in terms of the sustainability of those economic entities. So in the short run, I think it will buy some time for those communities. Once the dislocation occurs, it's very hard to get it back again. And finally, there is a link between this and a much broader public policy question that has to do with whether Oregon is going to move at the federal level to retain the right to process essentially domestically grown timber within our borders.
This is for Senator Kitzhaber. Isaac Regenstrife, City Club member. You've talked a lot about the impact of the measure in terms of convincing Congress to not lift the ban on federal lands. What will be the impact if Congress does not act to enable the state to do this action? Will there be any impact of ballot measure 2?
Answer is no. This is essentially enabling legislation to change our Constitution to allow us to move in and implement a log export ban, but it would require action by Congress, and bills to address that question have been introduced by Senator Packwood and I believe by Congressman DeFazio as well.
Senator Dukes, do you have a comment?
Well, just that without that enabling legislation from Congress, we can vote as long as we like, but it won't become law.
Dan Goldie, City Club member, and Ralph, now I'll show you how to do it. This is to Senator Dukes. You stated in your opening remarks that the enactment of if logs exports were banned, it would constitute a subsidy to the mills, and that there would be less money received for the logs because of there'd be fewer bidders. Are you not aware of the fact that at the present time the timber shortage is such that log costs have risen above the value of the lumber that's produced? And if you're not aware of it, why not?
I think it depends on where you get your information. The price has increased on logs starting in about 87, 88. And the reason for, actually it was maybe 86. The reason for that initial increase was the devaluation of the American dollar, which allowed the Japanese to be able to bid more effectively for and purchase more logs from America. And that was the initial beginning. And that was before we had all of the federal injunctions, and the whole spotted owl issue was truly an issue that was causing us not to be able to harvest timber. The shortage of timber supply as a result of fires in Oregon and as a result of the environmental injunctions have stimulated that. And it's really an open discussion as to which one has caused the increase. As Senator Kitzhaber was saying, there have been some $400 a board foot sales, but there haven't been a lot of them. When I left the county commission in Clatsop County in 1987, they were $139,000 a thousand board foot. So it has increased, and you can go either way. But yes, we're talking about such a small amount of timber that we're also talking about a small amount of mills. To the average mill owner in this state, a ban on the export of logs from state timberland will do nothing.
Senator Kitzhaber, would you like to comment? Okay.
My name is Jim Thayer. I'm a City Club member. I guess I'm a little bit puzzled. I think that the entire discussion has somewhat missed the basic point, and I believe that is competitiveness. I mean, why is it that presumably there is such a high demand for logs? I would presume it's because the buyers feel that they can process that, bring it to market more cheaply than that can be done here. Why is it then that this particular ban will bring more competitiveness to our sawmills rather than simply making them bigger through a protectionist measure?
Well, it's real clear you can get a lot more money by selling a raw log in terms of stumpage fees than you can milling it domestically. And I guess there's two components to the answer. One of them is that the competition for those logs is driving up stumpage prices to a tremendous extent, and the ability of a local mill to push up the price of finished product to cover the costs of obtaining the raw material is becoming increasingly more difficult. They're very constricted in their ability to do that. What that translates to ultimately is a mill in trouble and the loss of jobs. So I guess you can look at this from a pure free enterprise picture. You can also look at it as how do we maintain our economic base in this state, and that means tempering that viewpoint with the reality that if we do not maintain manufacturing jobs in the state of Oregon, we are not going to be able to sustain the social infrastructure that is going to prepare us or enable us to compete anywhere in the 21st century.
The competition issue is one of those that has interested Congress, and one of the reasons that a bill has not passed Congress yet. How do you decide that, or state very openly that you can bid and you can't bid? That's a real touchy issue to get into, and it's one that in a free enterprise system we don't often adopt, and that's been one of the hang-ups of the bill in Congress. As far as mill owners not being able to compete and not being able to bid, when SJR 8 was before the House of Representatives and we had testimony there, we had a rather large mill owner who came in and testified just to that fact. The prices had gone so high that he was not able to buy state land sales and was, having difficulty keeping his mill going as a result of it. He was later, at another hearing, brought in by the chairman who explained that that very day he had bought 2 sales in my own county, in Clatsop County.
Steve Shell, member. Senator Dukes, Adam Smith, as I understand him, tells us that the wealth of nations is encouraged not by hoarding what we have, but rather by causing the free flow of goods, not by protectionism, but by free trade. We've talked about the Clatsop here, but we haven't talked about the Elliott. Isn't this a protectionist measure for the Elliott State Forest and for the companies that draw timber out of the Elliott State Forest? And aren't we better served by getting Carla Hills to open up the Japanese markets rather than constrain our production here?
Well, the Elliott State Forest does have a higher percentage of export, although the actual number of board foot going out of the Elliott, because it's such a small forest, is smaller, has a higher percentage of export. The result of that and the competitive bid differences that we've been talking about go directly into the Common School Fund, which is that money that goes to help support school districts throughout the state, which gets into the whole school funding issue that you've probably heard more than you'd like to hear about recently. I personally believe that working on a trade relationship with Japan to open those doors for finished lumber and to open them wider, and interestingly, in the last 3 years there have been a higher increase in the export of finished lumber out of the Pacific states than there has been logs. So we are headed in that direction. But to enhance that and to get it going faster would be a far more positive approach to take than one that says that we're going to harm the schools in Oregon and possibly the economy of part of Oregon in order to be able to accomplish some end.
If I could just comment briefly on that. I think you need to do both. I mean, clearly we need to look at our trade arrangements with the Pacific Rim, but we also have to look at the internal barriers or the obstacles that keep the local industry from investing in value-added processing. And we're beginning to do that in the state of Oregon, but once we do that, we want to make sure we have some raw material available for them to utilize. And if I could just add one comment on the issue of school finance, the Common School Fund in 1988 contributed $12 million to Oregon schools. The total school budget is $1.7 billion, and I would suggest that's not a significant amount of money in anybody's calculation.
Pat Amadeo, City Club member. President Kitzhaber, from 1961 until 1984, the state of Oregon effectively had a ban on log exports from state lands. There's no record of the county trust lands opposing that policy or trying to alter it during that period. Do you know why they're interested in taking this position now?
I think maybe you should have been at the other microphone. I can't speak to that. But I'm sure Joan has an answer for you.
Yeah. First off, when the first ban went into effect, there was not the situation in the price difference in log exports that we have today. My county, Clatsop County, has always opposed and will always continue to oppose a ban on the export of logs. And to the best of my knowledge, Tillamook County, the other county primarily affected by this issue, has always and will always continue to oppose. Other counties don't. In fact, in the House, we had amendments in a minority report on the floor that would have given the counties, affected counties, each individually, the authority to decide whether or not they wanted to participate. And you could ban the export of logs from a given county on state forest land if they went along. There are counties that would have done that, counties that had a smaller proportion of logs or of timber supply from state forest land, and they would have gone along. But there has been significant difficulty always in keeping a ban on the export of logs. There were several Attorney General's opinions between, I think it was 63 and 74, showing that they were unconstitutional. Substitution bills that were introduced in the legislature during that time failed one after again and again, and as recently as last session, we weren't even able to put out a memorial to Congress. So that while there was a ban in effect, the land board took theirs off sooner than the state legislature did, and they have been very difficult to make, in fact, and impossible to actually make them strict bans.
I have a question for Senator Kitzhaber. What is the state's response to the trust counties who stand to lose revenue? Have there been discussions about general fund revenues ameliorating the impact?
Well, no, there haven't been discussions, and I guess I would oppose that. I don't subscribe to the theory that the county trust counties are going to, in fact, lose revenue. I mean, there are certain assumptions inherent in that. The inherent assumption is that the timber is either not going to be harvested or it's not going to be processed locally, and I don't believe that's the case. And I think that the long-term economic benefit to those counties from having a local, available timber supply for their mills is going to drive expansion of those mills and an increased employment in those counties, which will benefit not only the entire community, but also the school system.
I guess I can only say that if Senator Kitzhaber doesn't believe that this is going to be a revenue reduction of the counties, he's one of the few people in the state who doesn't. There was never any suggestion of that in any of the hearings, and it surfaces very infrequently over the last several years as we've debated the issue. It's just the export of logs is a cyclical issue, and it does indeed peak the price, and that's what this is all about. This is all about getting lower prices for logs, and this will do that. In terms of long-term availability of timber for the state of Oregon, this just isn't going to do it. 50,000 board foot of timber available to the state of Oregon just isn't going to do it.
Mike.
Ed Christie, I'm a member, City Club. Those of us who have been in the industry for some time have seen a cyclical thing in this log business, and as you just mentioned, yes. What do you believe will happen to the logs when we see the next cycle come along whereby you can't get rid of your logs, and so all up and down the coast we have piles of logs that aren't moving?
Well, I think you have to take some assumptions when you deal with that. In order to not be able to get rid of them, we have to have a downturn in the construction industry and in the building trades, a serious recession kind of or depression kind of downturn, and we have to not have a decent production from pulp and paper mills, from chip. I have a mill coming into my district that will produce just chips to be exported to Japan for pulp and paper purposes. We have indeed produced and are continuing to produce a lot of secondary products from timber, and I think that that stands us in better stead as we go into the future with timber products. So I guess I don't see that we're going to end up in that situation again. Indeed we can, and if we do, then we're going to end up with $139 a thousand board foot where we were in years past. That is the nature of being in the timber business. That is the nature of being a timber landowner, and you live with it. The trust land counties certainly have for years and will continue to do so, but at the time when it's to their benefit, I don't think we really ought to be taking that away from them when we took the lands from them to start out with.
Do you have a response, Senator Kitzhaber? Okay. Would it be practical to charge an export duty on logs to decrease the export of logs? If feasible, it would add welcome income to decrease the federal budget deficit.
You certainly could. There are a lot of positive options that would result in the same benefit to mill owners or the same benefit to the economy of the state of Oregon. And if you'll allow me in my closing, I will refer to some of those.
It certainly is feasible. That's exactly what the state of Washington does. I believe they have essentially 100% export tax between what you pay for the log and what you are exporting it for, and sort of like how much do you earn, send it to me, which is effectively a ban on log exports. So I suppose if you didn't want to absolutely ban them, you'd have to tailor that somewhat to make sure that you didn't take all the incentive away from exporting the logs. This is a much cleaner way to do it, of course.
Why are we selling whole logs to foreign countries, then building our own homes in Portland and the rest of Oregon with Canadian lumber?
We do import Canadian lumber. I don't know that we're building lots and lots of our homes with those. We also export finished lumber to Canada, and we export logs to Canada as well.
Doesn't make sense to me.
Senator Kitzhaber, proponents of ballot measure 2 claim that log exports are a major factor in Oregon's timber shortage, yet the vast majority of logs exported from Oregon are from private lands. Does this mean you support Congressman DeFazio's call for a ban on all log exports, including those from private lands?
Well, let me speak as my own, in the role of being my own proponent and not someone else's. I don't believe that log exports are the major cause of the timber shortage problem in Oregon. They are certainly a component of it, and I don't think you can have a serious discussion of timber supply without also talking about log exports. So that's just want to clarify that. I don't think at this point that we are at a place where we need to extend that ban to private forest lands. My biggest concern is having the flexibility to make these choices on lands that fall into the public domain. That would be state forest lands and that would be federal forest lands. And that accounts for about 64% of the forested lands in the state of Oregon. That's very, very significant. I think if we can manage that in a way that gives us a sustained yield, and if those private timberland owners want to participate in helping us make the political decisions that allow a sound management policy, then I think the day when we have to extend this ban to private lands because it's a critical resource is probably not going to occur.
Okay. We have one last written question which builds on a prior question. Isn't the real question here about why our mills aren't competitive? Why aren't they tooled for second growth and metric cutting?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the mills. Some mills have. Actually, it's an extremely expensive process for a mill to go through the modernization of switching to metric. Some of them have done that. I have one of the more progressive ones in my district and one of the earliest to do that. I think the whole competition thing is an issue. I don't believe that you're going to see more finished product exported simply because we ban the export of logs. I can't honestly tell you why they're not. Again, in my closing, I have some suggestions, and I do have a bill in the legislature this session that hopefully will help them to do that.
Clearly, we have to look at retooling our mills, and that is a part of the problem. The need to do that, however, doesn't negate the concern over exporting raw materials. But clearly, if we ban log exports and do everything else we need to do, if some mills are not willing to look at the fact that they're going to have to handle smaller second-growth trees, we're going to have unemployment in mill towns. And this is, I'm going to have to insert a wee political message here. There is a county commissioner in Jackson County who had the audacity to suggest that maybe we should look at retraining mill workers, Commissioner Jeff Golden, because there is inevitably going to be some job loss because of that, and he is under a recall attempt for suggesting that we should look after the victims of the changes in our timber industry. And I think that's outrageous, and I think we have to adopt a much broader, more visionary attitude if we want to get out of this whole situation together as a community and as a state, and we can do that.
It's time to start our closings. Senator Dukes, we'll let you begin.
Thank you. It's been an interesting debate, and we've narrowed it down to a few issues. And there are some side things that I think you should probably know about as we close this and go on to the rest of our day. There is no organized opposition to ballot measure 2. That agreement was made while the bill was in the legislature, and those folks that were opposed have chosen to submit statements to the voters' pamphlet and vote their own ballot, but there is no organized opposition to it. Nonetheless, those in favor of it have raised $791,000 to buy radio and television time, to put out brochures, to do a mailing, to buy top-flight advertising, to convince you to vote yes in a bill that will pass overwhelmingly at the polls, and there has never been any doubt about that. 6 lumber mills contributed $100,000 each to that process, with others ranging from $5,000 to $50,000 contributions. And I think you need to ask, and it's got to be a real easy answer, why? There are positive alternatives. Senate Bill 947 is making its way through the state legislature. It's a tax credit for mills to allow them to modernize and to expand. It's also a refundable tax credit, because most of the mills in this state, especially the smaller mills, have no present tax liability. One of the reasons, in my opinion, is because they are not able to be as competitive as they ought to be. Representative Tom Hanlon and my hope when we introduced this bill was to be able to allow them to do what they need to do to create and expand their product line so that they could become tax liable in the state of Oregon, thereby helping the economy. Incidentally, this measure takes effect only if the bill we spoke about before Congress passes, or if the U.S. Supreme Court or the State Attorney General changes their minds. For all the political rhetoric, for all the emotional accusations, for all the money, this is one measure that may never become law.
Thank you. Senator Kitzhaber, your closing.
I guess I'll just speak in somewhat more general terms. I think we're all concerned about maintaining our industrial base, and I think we can have healthy counties and healthy ports and healthy schools without exporting our raw materials. Doug fir is clearly one of the few raw materials for which Oregon has a clear competitive advantage. This proposed log export ban and its implications and linkage to federal policy are a part of the overall strategy that I think we're going to have to pursue in order to maintain our economic viability in the state of Oregon. This problem really does extend beyond Oregon, however. You know, we have a society today that has a $2.75 trillion national debt and a $10 trillion unfunded liability between what we think our kids are going to make and what we plan to take out of their pockets to fund the $400 billion we spend a year on Medicare, Social Security, and federal pensions. And the people that have to support these tremendous programs are the people in the workforce, who are the people that are now slipping more and more into service and manufacturing jobs. The only way this country can increase its productivity enough to deal with these economic challenges is to increase the number of manufacturing jobs that we have in Oregon and around the country. This country cannot survive if we become a service and retail-based economy exclusively. And anything that we can do to increase the availability of manufacturing jobs, family wage jobs, is going to help us all in the long term. Processing raw materials, of which Oregon has an abundant supply in Oregon domestically, creates those kinds of jobs. And I think that's an important element in any long-term economic strategy.
Please join me in thanking the senators for an enlightening debate. We are adjourned.